All right, so our mash is all about enzymes and temperatures. That's our secret. So enzymes and temperatures. And for a small part of it, also pH. So we got sometimes pH of our solution. A lot of people make a big deal out of pH. I've seen stuff where if you didn't care about pH, it still works. Might not be like exactly what you're going for, but the mash can still work. All right, so what is the mash? We talked about it. We're going to have a vessel called the mash tun. All right, this is our mash tun. This is where our mash will take place. We have at the bottom something called a false bottom. That's exactly what it is. It's a false bottom. It's something at the bottom that is going to allow the grains to sit on them. Here's all the grains sitting on top, and it keeps the grain completely off the bottom. Usually this is some sort of mesh type of screen, like a colander, right, that you drain noodles with. Other times, the false bottom is not necessarily a false bottom, but it's a manifold, where it's pipes with holes down at the very bottom. Its purpose is to allow the wort to drain through to the bottom so that we can then pipe it over to the boil kettle. So we have our grain here. It's our grain. We would refer to as the grain bed, and then this is, we have water. All right. We're heating this up. This is going to be a hot reaction where we have our optimum temps of 140 to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. And theoretically, our optimum pH should be between 5.4 and 5.6. That's a theoretical optimum. Because again, I've known people who didn't worry about pHs, didn't worry about adjusting the pH, and it comes out just fine. We're doing it at these temperatures because we want a fast rate of reaction. We are utilizing these enzymes that were in the grain to break the starches down into sugar. All right? And we already went over what those starches are. So the starches are those branch points. They're glucose molecules just linked together. All right? And then they can be broken down so that we have one glucose molecule. We can have two glucose molecules, which is maltose. We can have three glucose molecules, which is maltotriose. And then we have something else called limit dextrins. So our sugars of interest, so just recall these are our starch molecules. That's our starch molecules. Remember how I made it. All right, so one of these is glucose. And it's, yeah, I had more of them. Like I kind of did straight lines, but we've got, each of these is a glucose. So one of them is glucose. This is very easily fermentable. %100% fermentable. The yeast can use all of it. Is that a good thing? It is if you're, I know this isn't part of the class, but if you're making a hard liquor, vodka, whiskey, gin, in that case, You want as much sugar as in there because then you're going to distill it off. Right? So glucose is a good thing. 2-glucose is maltose. 2-glucose molecules. And this is actually pretty good because the yeast love this. Our 3, maltotriose. So not all of our yeast can use it. And then we have, we've got 4 and 5 and 6 chain. All of the others which could be that's an example. That's an example. All of these other ones, they still have glucose molecules, but we've chopped them up into smaller parts that are bigger than a single glucose, a maltose, or a maltotriose molecules. All of these are called dextrins, and we'll actually be specific. These are limit dextrins. These are unfermentable. The yeast can't use them. So they are left in the final product. They're left in our beer, basically. Their contribution is to mouthfeel. How do you perceive that beer? Do you perceive it as being thick, which means we have a lot of limit dextrins? Or do you perceive it as being very thin, which means we have very few limit dextrins in that beer? Right? In terms of like a food that you may have encountered, say you have chicken stock or chicken broth. Sometimes the chicken broth tastes and feels like it's very rich. Other times it feels very watery. You can say that one that's very rich has a lot of these large compounds, these limit dextrins in it. It gives that mouthfeel that feels like thick. All right? The watered down version has very few of those compounds. It's the same thing with the beer. You can have a very thick feeling beer or a very thin, watery feeling beer. All right? How do we get these? Well, it comes down to our alpha and beta amylases. They're functional at these temperatures, but at the lower temperatures, one of those amylases is favored. At the higher temperatures, the other ones is favored. So what we can do is utilize our temperature range, where we're going to hold the mash, to affect how much of these limit dextrins we can produce. All right? So that means we can produce a dark beer, and I know the perception's out there. Dark beer is a thick beer. I heard, we don't do Guinness stouts because they're motor oil. No, actually Guinness stouts has very few of those. It's actually a very thin beer. It doesn't have much of these. But then you go to a very light beer. Say, well, I like lighter beers because they're less on the stomach. Well, we can make a lot of those lighter beers feel very thick and very, very full and filling, all through temperature differences. So let's talk about our temperatures. And we're actually going to start at the lower end of the temperature range. All right? Because historically, they didn't have a computer to do their brew process. Right now, it's as simple as pushing a button and everything's automated. From the crushing of the grain, moving the grain into the mash tun, spraying the water, the electric hot water, everything's automated. But we didn't have that. So we're going to talk about the various temperatures and enzymes that are active throughout the mash. All right, so temperatures and enzymes. And we're going to give specific temperature ranges and why we might use it. So historically speaking, brewers would take the water and add the water in with the grain at like room temperature, warmer than room temperature, lukewarm temperatures, and they'd let it sit. Right? A lot of that was aimed at trying to decrease the pH. So it's low temperatures, it's well below optimum temperature range. We still have conversion, we still have starches turning into sugars, but it doesn't happen very, very quickly. Instead, we're utilizing just the natural processes that will acidify the mash. And then we have raising of the temperature to 104. All right. So this is still a warm temperature. You're going to perceive it as just being a little bit lukewarm. This has a rest name. It's beta glucanase and phytase rest. Right. These are essentially debranching enzymes. So our starches have a lot of those branch points. We said the amylases didn't attack those. They couldn't break the branches. They can only break individual ends, and some of our enzymes can only go within a certain number of glucoses to those branches. So at this, what we do is we can have it at 104 to limit how many branches we actually have. Debranching enzymes. So debranching enzymes, which limit the number of dextrins that are produced. So you don't want a thick beer. Maybe you want a very thin beer. You go for this. All right. Now, beta glucanase and phytase do a little bit two different purposes. All right. So phytase was always used to lower the pH, breaks things down, liberate some hydrogen ions to decrease our pH. Beta glucanase breaks down the gummy proteins in these grains. All right. In our barley, we don't have to worry too much about it. But if we use like wheat or oats or rye, those have a lot of glucanase. That's why we use bread, why we can make bread with those. And those gummy proteins can clog up the grain bed and make it difficult to drain and rinse the grain. So what we can do is use, if we're using a lot of wheat or a lot of rye, we can do this rest to kind of break things down a bit and decrease the chances that we stick, get a stuck mash. Yep.
The 104 one that makes the dark beer?
No.
It's the light one.
No. We'll get to there.
Okay.
We'll get to there. All right. So this one kind of helps prevent some of the limit dextrins and makes things easier to work with. Our next temperature is 109 to 114. This has another specific name. It's called the ferulic acid rest. Ferulic acid rest produces ferulic acid. So it has an enzyme that will break a compound down in the grain to produce something called ferulic acid, which is a precursor to a compound 4-vinyl guaiacol. Or 4VG. This is almost a requirement in German wheat beers because this compound is the clove aroma and flavor. Wheat usually has a lot of it. Now, again, historically, this is how brewers change it. a German wheat beer, a German Hefeweizen, has the characteristic wheat aroma, wheat flavors, but also it has banana and it has clove. The balance between those two is up to the brewer. Perhaps the brewer wants more banana, all right? In which case they limit this rest. Perhaps a brewer wants more clove. Then they're going to try to produce as much of this. Does this develop in our mash? Not at all. It's the yeast that do this. So if we use a wheat yeast, they'll break that down. And they'll produce that 4-vinyl glycol and produce that clove aroma, clove flavor. All right? So if we're not doing a wheat, we don't really need that rest. Yeah, barley has some of it, but we don't really need it. Our next temperature is 122 to 132. So we're approaching our optimum temperatures. So the temperatures that are optimum for the amylases. At this rest, this is our protein rest. And big brewers will use this. They will stop here. And the question is why? What's it doing? Well, there's two enzymes of importance. Protease and peptidase. Okay. Both of those are enzymes. Both of them will break down proteins, hence the protein rest. But we're breaking them down for two different purposes. The protease breaks down large proteins and these large proteins are the ones that contribute to haze of the beer. And this isn't like haziness because it has a lot of yeast in it. This is hazy because it has a lot of these large proteins in it. So some of the wheats, all right, some of the rye, they have a lot of protein, or they can have a lot of protein. So you can use a protein rest to kind of break those large proteins down into smaller pieces, and by doing that, you would reduce or eliminate the haze in it. So when you chill the beer, it's going to be clear. When it warms up, it's going to be clear, and so forth. Peptidase serves a different purpose. It's going to break proteins down and release nitrogen. Why do we need it? For the yeast. Our yeast need the nitrogen. It's a nutrient for them. Do we have to do that now? No, not really. Our grains are such that we don't really need this rest to increase nitrogen. About the only time you might need it is if you're using a lot of non-grain compounds, non-grain sugar sources. So like if you do like a mead is a honey wine, if you only used honey for the sugar source, you're going to have to supplement the yeast with some of these nutrients. Yep.
I have a question. Then how do they make rice wine?
With rice.
Right?
Yep.
Do they follow the same thing as this or no?
They'll do a cereal rest. Yeah, they'll do a cereal rest at a higher temperature. So they'll first kind of like mash it, make it gummy, and then they'll kind of bring it down, and yeah, they'll add some amylase or they'll add something that will convert the starches into sugars and then ferment it. Yep, same way, same purpose. There's a Peruvian beer called Chicha that doesn't utilize a mash. Has anyone heard of that?
Yes, because when I used to work in Comstock, there were some Peruvians that were asking about that.
Yeah,
Like,
do
they brought it over.
Do they know how they make it?
No, they actually brew it. They have this stuff in here. Comstock, they brew it.
Yeah. Do you know how they do it?
No, not really. They just don't tell me. They just like, you want some?
Do you want some? It's a trick. I wouldn't mind trying it, but they don't have a mash. You have to have a way to convert the starches to sugars. So what do? They pop the grain in their mouth, they chew it, Our spit has these enzymes that break the starches down into sugar, and then they spit into their fermenter. It's like you're drinking spit, which is gross, right? Totally. But yeah, cool. All right, so our protein rest definitely reduce some haze if we have issues with haziness. And then we get to our optimum temperatures. All right, this rest is called the saccharification rest. All right, saccharification, a saccharide is a sugar molecule. So saccharification rest is production of sugars. We're breaking our starches down into sugars. Now, that reaction, starch to sugars, is occurring at these lower temperatures, but it's going very slowly. It's at this temperature where we start to really speed up. Within this range, our enzymes will react differently. All right, so we've got a lower temperature range from 140 to 151, and then we have an upper temperature range, 149 to 158. At this lower temperature, beta amylase is most active. At the upper temperature, alpha amylase is most active. And I'm going to say not even most active. It's going to be the only one that's active. Because our beta amylase will be denatured. The function of these enzymes, the function of these proteins rely on their three-dimensional shape. All right? Once we heat them up too much, they will unfold and then they lose their activity. That's if you've cooked eggs. The egg white is clear, basically clear when you crack the egg, but when you heat it up, we induce a change where the proteins kind of fold and then they get back into that white solid color. Right? That's what's going to happen at our higher temperatures. It's these two things that are going to control our mouthfeel. All right? So if we were going just for a balanced beer, we're targeting 149 to about 153. To represent kind of a balanced beer. So we're balancing the activity of both. We're allowing beta amylase to work, at least during the first part of it, and then once the beta amylase denatures, then alpha amylase finishes up. So we kind of get a nice balance between those limit dextrins and the starches and sugars. All right? And we have to let this go on long enough for us to continue or to completely break down all of the starches in that beer into the sugar. All right, how long does it go? If we're doing the lower temperature, if we're at like the 143, 144 range, we're gonna probably have to let the mash go for an hour and a half. If we're doing at the upper end, let's say at 158, probably only need to let it go for about 30 to 45 minutes. All right, it's gonna happen very quickly. Here at this middle temperature, recommendation is an hour. Let it go for an hour, everything will be converted. And we'll come back to this. And then our last temperature, 168 degrees. This is called the mash out. The mash out, this temperature will denature all of the enzymes in our mash, and it'll stop the sugar conversion. It'll stop it. Why is that important? Repeatability. It's all about repeatability for the brewers. Once we figure out, once we have a recipe, once we have a process, we ferment, let's say, or we mash at 153, we let it go an hour, we need to stop it at an hour, because if we let it go longer, the enzymes that are available are still going to work. And if it takes us 1 hour, one day to get to this temperature, but 3 hours on the next day, they're going to be two different beers. They're going to probably differ in their mouthfeel, they're going to probably differ in their fermentability, and they're going to probably differ in their overall taste. All right, so let's talk about these alpha and beta amylases. So we talked about these temperatures, alpha and beta. So briefly, we did that. We briefly mentioned where we're cutting things on Monday. All right, so let's talk a little bit more specific. Beta amylase could be compared to hedge trimmers. You can think of those as hedge trimmers. So what you do is you think about our branch. Our starch molecules. Right? You think about our branch starch molecules. Our beta amylase are hedge trimmers. They're going to cut at the end of the branches. All right, they're going to cut at the end of our branches. And what they're going to do is chop off twos. Let's add a few more. Let's change this. Get to a point. It's going to chop off here to get to, I didn't move it. Let's move it one more. To add one more. There we go. They're about the same length, but we have different numbers here. They're chopping off two at a time so that we produce our maltose. But our requirement, or the limitation of these beta amylases, is that it'll only get within 3 glucose molecules to that branch point. So it goes to the end, just chomps away just like Pac-Man, all the way to produce these maltose molecules, and then once it gets to a branch point, it stops. It can't continue. Can it go here? No. This is a directional molecule. These are directional molecules. So beta amylase is going to leave a whole lot of these ends. A whole lot of these large molecules, branch molecules. Alpha amylase acts more like a pruner. I'm going to be a little bit more specific and say a reckless pruner. It's somebody who is so fed up with their hedges, and they say, I'm tired of this, I'm just going to prune it and cut it down. So they go in there with the hedge clippers, and they, not the trimmers, but with the pruning shears, and go one at a time, just recklessly breaking them. So I'm going to use the same spot, let's use a different color. So our alpha is going to cut indiscriminately. Maybe even some of the branch points. But every place that it cuts is going to give a new starting point for our beta amylase. All right? And we can get within 1 glucose molecule of the branch. We can't do the branch, we can't break it, but we can get within 1 branch point. There's some other enzymes that will break the branch points for us. But we don't really need to focus on it because this is what we're looking for. So this difference in mouthfeel comes down to which of these enzymes are active. All right. In our sweet spot, we have alpha amylase working. It's indiscriminately cutting, opening up free ends, which beta amylase can then come through and chomp through and produce a bunch of maltose molecules. All right. If we only had beta amylase, all right, at these lower temperatures, is alpha amylase working? It is. It's working slowly, all right? It's working slowly, but beta amylase is going to come in, hit those branch points, work as much as it can, kind of try to finish out with our maltose, and in the end, ultimately produce a very thin beer. Because we're basically chewing up everything except our branch points. That's it. So we're going to have very few limit dextrins. If we start raising our temperature and go at the upper end, alpha amylase is at work. Alpha amylase is indiscriminately cutting. But you can see from these cuts that we're going to have a mix of single glucose molecules, double, so maltose molecules. You're going to have some maltose trios. You're going to be left with some 4, some 5, some 6, some highly branched molecules all left, leaving us a whole lot of limit dextrins. All right, so if we are targeting our mouthfeel, we can do a high temp mesh. And we're talking at our 155 to 158 range. It'll finish quickly, it'll do what it can quickly, and then it stops. So for this type of high temperature mash, our alpha amylase is our primary active. We'll get maltose with much limit dextrins. And because of that, we will get a beer that would be described as thick, heavy, and sweet. So we get our maltose, we get fermentation happening, but we have a lot of these limit dextrins leading to our perception of it being thick, heavy, and sweet. Low temp mash, and now we're dealing with in our 140 to 149 range. Now we're getting both. We're getting alpha and beta amylases working. All right. Alpha amylase will work to help break down some of those molecules. It might not work super quickly, but it's going to be doing enough to where the beta amylase is going to come in and chew up all of those maltoses. All right. So we get a lot of maltose with few limit dextrins. And then our end product would be described as being thin, light, usually dry, and alcoholic. You say, why alcoholic? We've produced a lot of sugars that are going to be converted to alcohol. And there's nothing in there, very few limit dextrins that help to balance that alcohol. So you're going to get the full smell, you're going to get the full taste of it. So, color doesn't really matter. I can use a lot of dark roasted grains and make a very thin, light, and dry beer. I can use no dark grains and produce a very yellow and very clear beer that is somewhat clear, thick, heavy, and sweet. And I say somewhat clear because those limit dextrins will or can contribute to some of the haze. All right, so there is some things that I really push in this class as a major take-home point. This is one of them. Major take-home point. I don't care if you remember nothing else in this class. Just remember this. The color of the beer does not have anything to do with whether or not it feels thick or feels thin. That is all with our mash. That's our take-home. So as I said, Guinness Stout, it's actually a very thin beer, very few limit dextrins. I think the reason that people feel like it's thick and heavy is because it has very low carbonation. And you can do this, not with beer. Open up a can of Coke. All right, and let it sit out. Let it decarbonate completely. All right, you have that can of Coke, it's going to feel thick and syrupy. Then you open up a fresh one, it's going to feel a whole lot lighter because of that carbonation. That's why some people really like McDonald's Coke, because it is on the lower end of the carbonation scale. Feels a little bit sweeter. You must not like McDonald's Coke. All right, so I did ask you to tell me your topic. So did you look it up?
Yes, sir.
Where did we find it?
On